Sure. Muted and what?
Good morning. This is the 7th of the Dr. Oba T'Shaka shows, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to share some things with you. And for this morning, the title is Preparations for African and New African Identity Transformations. This show is distinguished from others by a number of things, one of which is that it's centered on transformation, and it's centered particularly around African and what I call New African, or you call African American identity. You'll see why I call it New African in a minute. And so this is more than just an informational show. This is a show that hopes to contribute to people's growth and development so that you can be better people, better Africans, better African Americans, and better human beings. So the focus on this show will extend the discussion that I've had before in the past, not on this show, but previous times on YouTube, where I've discussed the sixfold stages to mental freedom. And these have been described in a series of discussions and a e-course that I've offered on YouTube, 6 days. And some people who are watching this show have gone through it. The sixfold stages to mental freedom are also described in my book, The Integration Trap, The Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. And it's also described in a 40-page paper that goes with the purchase of the Integration Trap book. So today I won't be going through these stages so much. I'll do a little bit of summary in the end, but this is going to be a show dedicated more to understanding the basis for this transformational system, for understanding its deep roots, both in African and in African American, or what I prefer to call New African culture. And you might ask, why both? Well, because in any awakening process, you've got to both take your past and apply it to your present. And so we draw from the past of Africa, and the roots that we're going to find are the basis for African American, or what I prefer to call New African culture. And then we draw from the fruit. Africa's the root, African American culture is the fruit. So we need to understand both. And so very often when we talk about African ideas, we limit it to Africa, but we have to apply it in our lives in living in America or whatever part of the world people who are watching this come from. So this is the central point then of today's thing or discussion, is to discuss the basis for this transformational system. What are its roots? What's its depth? And we need to understand both the historical and spiritual roots of our culture, and especially the spiritual roots. But the history is necessary because we often won't recognize an experience that is African in a new African American context, because we won't know that that is African based. So this is the first purpose for this discussion today, to understand the roots and understand the trials and difficulties we had in constructing a African culture here in the United States. The second purpose for this discussion is to prepare you for what will be a 12-week course that I'm going to offer on YouTube next year. There will be a combination of African and African American history and spirituality, which is the basis for African philosophy or African deep thought. And that will be an experience that will enable people to go deeply into the transformational process that I call the sixfold stages to mental freedom. As a revolutionary and as a scholar warrior, I've undergone this transformation. I've described before that Malcolm underwent this transformation, as did the person that you see over my shoulder with the sunglasses on, Amilcar Cabral, the greatest leader in the 20th century. And many of our people underwent this transformation in the 60s, but many did not. And one of the key reasons that a lot of groups did not succeed in the liberation struggle was that they failed to transform the consciousness of people that joined their ranks. Because if you're going to free up society, you first all have to start with freeing yourself. And that begins with freeing your mind and bringing your mind in contact and connection with your spirit. So this transformational system is a system of identity transformation. One of the people that I work with a lot in describing the effect of this system on him, and this is, I've taken people through this system for over 50 years, said that this system didn't tell him what he was, it gave him an understanding of who he was. And the who is your identity, who you are as an African person. The what is your destiny, or what in ancient Kemet is called the Ka. Those are your gifts. So this system of the sixfold stages to mental freedom deals with identity transformation, particularly African and African American. And I should say this identity transformation applies to people of color as well, because they have undergone a similar process, though the historical circumstances are different. So this is the central purpose of this discussion today, is to focus on African identity transformation, particularly understanding its foundations, its roots, its strengths, and understanding also our strengths and weaknesses, and it's the weaknesses that we want to overcome. Amilcar Cabral said that the greatest weakness the greatest enemy that a people have in a liberation struggle is a fight against their own weaknesses. So this won't be just a discussion of how great we are, but it'll also be a discussion of how we can overcome certain things that are internal to us that we need to rid ourselves of. And some of us are working deeply on, and some of us have overcome, but none of us have fully overcome this. So the first question is then, why do Blacks need a transformational system? Why do they need a system that promotes mental freedom? Most people would expect me to give the answer that it's enslavement, and what we need to do is overcome what has now become post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I would agree with that. That is part of it. But what most of us have missed is some things have happened to our people since enslavement Since the late 1960s, since post-1968, which involved an attack on Black communities in the United States and on the African world, the Caribbean, Africa, Africans in Europe, but slightly different but similar. And these forces in the United States have been the forces of deindustrialization that have taken jobs out of the Black community. We discussed this a little bit before. This has caused the greatest hit on African American families because we were able to maintain two-parent households from 1865 to 1968. Now we have 29%. A greater erosion in Black family two-parent households has occurred between 1968 and now than between 1619 and 1968. And that has been caused by powerful forces that have hit us. And so this discussion of lessons for the transformation of consciousness is not only to apply to what hit us in enslavement, but to apply to what's hitting us right now. And these forces that have hit us, we know, include drugs that hit our communities heavily in the 1980s, assassination of our leadership, breaking up of Black communities, erosion but not destruction of extended family communities caused by these forces, especially the forces of violence caused by the drug culture. As Dr. Siri McDougall's discussion pointed out last week, the extended family is still quite strong. That is the family of our blood relations and those we bring into the family. The extended family community, where the extended family community serves as family for our people, has been weakened. It's still there, but it's weakened. And we need to draw on this identity transformation and other strengths in our culture to strengthen the extended family community. And so we need this transformational system to address two breaks that have hit us. One is breaks caused by and traumas and issues caused by enslavement, the other by the forces that have hit us since 1968. And I want to say overall this, as you're going to see, in the enslavement process, Africans did something very original. They drew on the best of African culture to create something new here. And we're going to draw on that in a minute. The crisis that affects the African American community today and the African world at large now has put us in a different situation where some of us are now stepping out of our rich culture. Some of us don't even know it. And this is a topic that I go into in depth in the integration trap, and we'll be discussing in more detail in future discussions. But I'll just give one example. We as a people have the lowest suicide rate of any people in this country. And that includes whites. But in the last couple of years, 7 to 11-year-old young Blacks have registered a higher suicide rate than whites. And this has never happened before. And anytime you see young people of that age even thinking about taking their life, then that means something serious has happened, because Black people might do things like drink a lot or do other things that over time may take them out, but they don't consciously shoot themselves in the head, or in the case of the young people who are committing suicide, many of them are strangling themselves to death or hanging themselves. Now, this is a small number, but the fact that this is occurring is telling us that the forces that have hit us since 1968 has put us in a new position where for the first time, our people very often unconsciously are choosing between an African American, African-based culture and a mad Euro-American culture. And we're seeing for the first time, some of us are making the wrong choices. Some real serious changes have occurred in the Black community. and we have not properly diagnosed them, and we are often attributing all of this to slavery. So while I'm going to focus on some particular issues that arise out of slavery that are ghosts that we have to deal with now, I want to stress that the sixfold stages to mental freedom, this whole process of awakening, applies both to the past and to the present. So this is the second reason that we need this transformational system. One, to deal with the ghost of enslavement, the other to deal with the post-1968 forces that have produced what God revealed to me to be a choice between two cultures. This affects the African world, not just here. So when we deal with the issue of enslavement, it's very important to start with this fact. Historically, when we dealt with Blackness, that is, when we dealt with the civilizations of ancient Africa, the civilization of Kemet that was described in charcoal and Meru Neter, KM as KMT, which was portrayed as black charcoal or a black person, so that the Kemites defined themselves as black people. And that was true throughout Africa because we're black people. It was just simply a description of your color. But under colonialism and enslavement, Blackness takes on a new meaning. Blackness is now defined in relationship to whites, because now whites have control after 100 years of war, particularly culminating in the end of the 19th century, where Africans resisted colonialism and had resisted it much longer than that, and leading to colonization, or where outsiders can come in and take over your land and your country. And then through the enslavement system, the slave trade. And so what happens when the African is brought under colonialism and slavery, the African is put into a new world. It isn't just the new world in the Western Hemisphere, the United States or the Caribbean or South America, or even Europe to an extent. It's a world of the mind. And so we are taken into a new mindset. And in this new mindset, Black takes on a different meaning. Black is defined according to whiteness. And Black is defined according to whiteness because now racism is being used as a denominator for defining who you are. So whereas before, the Kemites would say that they are people who are Black, or the Greeks would say, for they are like the Colchians, they have black skin and woolly hair, and that's a description of who they are. And then they have to say, well, but that isn't the only thing that's important about them, because there were a lot of Black civilizations at that time. So they have to go on and make other distinctions to define who they were. They are Kemites, what the world came to call Egyptians. But under the regime of colonialism and slavery, Blackness becomes savage and uncivilized. Blackness, because whites now have control of your lives and of your land, they can now go back into your past and distort your past and give you a false narrative or a false story or a false image. And so the greatest classical civilization in the ancient world, ancient Kemet, no civilization greater than that, historians generally agree, is now written out of Black history. In fact, Blacks are written out of history, period, reduced to the level in their minds of savagery. And so instead of Kemet being the land of the Blacks, according to Hegel, who is one of the most prominent European philosophers and historians, he says it's a part of the spirit of Asia. How can you be a part of the African landmass and be a part of the spirit of a people who don't live on that landmass? And how can you be a part of the spirit of Asia when the Asians hadn't yet 3,000, 3,200, or if you want to go back to the beginning, 10,000 BC when pre-dynastic Kemet starts, where there was no Asian civilization, no China, for example, no Japan, for example. And by the way, the founders of both of those were Anu, Black people. So how do you become a part of the spirit of Asia? It's completely irrational. But the point is, that's the picture that is drummed into our head. And the rest of Africa is treated as savage Africa, Black Africa. So for 249 years, Africans in America have drummed in their heads a savage in Africa, a slave in America. On the plantation, there was what you would call a civilizational conflict. And that civilizational conflict was between the Yoruba, the Asante, the Fulani, the Igbo, the Angolans, and many others who came here not identifying themselves as Africans, but from a specific African ethnic group, but they shared common set of cultural unities. And so as they underwent enslavement, they had to come in conflict with this false image and false perception of themselves. In the beginning, the saltwater Africans, those are the ones that come off the boat of enslavement. To them, this is a joke. You know what I mean? What are they talking about? They come in with African pride and they come in with African courage. But over a century and a half, the message is continually drummed in, and it has an effect on some of our people because we come into this reality of two worlds, the world of the European culture and their perception, which is grounded in racism, and our world. And so in these two worlds, some begin to take a view of the color of their skin that is shaped by the perception of the enslaver or the colonizer, which is instead of Black as naturally beautiful, and you don't even think about it, it is just naturally so, Black becomes ugly. Instead of your hair, woolly and sometimes straight, but usually woolly, it becomes kinky. Your nose becomes too big. Your lips are too big. And so this is defined as ugly. So some Blacks take on this mentality. And it's a mentality that is a ghost of slavery that we still have to live with, the ghost of the color complex. And even though the awakening in the 60s overturned that in the minds of some of our people, it still resides in our consciousness, and not just here, but in the Caribbean and in South America as well, or wherever Africans are. And we know people of color suffer this same thing. The darker they are in any historical or cultural context, the more put down they are. The Filipino who's dark skinned is put down. The Mexican who is dark skinned, who's made up of both Indian, Spanish, and African, is put down. In fact, my favorite leader of the Mexican Revolution is Emiliano Zapata. His picture is right behind this screen because he's one of the greatest revolutionaries in the history of the world. His grandmother was African. He was dark complexion, but when they put out a picture of him, they lighten him up. You know what I mean? So this isn't just our problem, but it is a problem laid on us especially. So this is part of the ghost of slavery that this awakening process has to deal with. Because as one of our great scholars said, the only integration Black people need is between light-skinned Blacks and dark-skinned Blacks, and I would say between light-minded Blacks and dark-minded Blacks. And I don't care what your shade is, if your mind ain't Black, you're in trouble. Or as the hip hoppers say, we got to go black to the future. We got to embrace this blackness. But if you got problems with seeing yourself through the eyes of someone else, then you're going to have to undergo transformation so that you can see the beauty that is right before your eyes. So this is part of what we have to deal with. Now, this is often missed in our discussion of African consciousness. We often dismiss Black identity as something that's subordinate, something that we have to move beyond. Well, the Kemites never moved beyond describing themselves as Black as an adjective, you know, it was a color of their skin. And why would you want to move, you know, past it? It's a matter of linking Blackness to your African roots. So we have to understand that the African in America had a special experience in that we had whites all around us. And so as a result of that, we had to really deal with the culture of peoplehood in a very special way. And so over a period of 100, 150 years, after our people could no longer remember what part of Africa we came from, we came to see whether of Fulani roots, Bambara, Igbo, we had intermarried by then and everything else that happened to us. And what we began to see is we had a commonality. And that commonality was the basis for our oppression, but it was also the basis for our love and pride in ourselves, and it was the color of our skin. And so Blackness became a unifying thing for the majority of our people. And Blackness became the shell around which our culture was built. I want to say the shell because it's not the whole of the culture. Inside of that is both African and New African principles and some other things that come in that we need to get out. So the African in America, because of racism, shaped what's called race consciousness. It is the consciousness of being Black in a society in which whites are still dominating. And it's the consciousness that we must band together as one people. And it is this glue that has created race consciousness. It is the basis for race pride. It produced in the 19th and earlier 20th century race men and race women. It has produced the greatest amount of unity that any people have on the planet. As I pointed out before, the Montgomery bus boycott, 97% of Black people supporting that. Or Barack Obama, 96% in his first term supporting him. Or in this recent election, 89% of Black people going behind Biden. But it's not just in electoral politics, and it's not just in movements, but it is in marriage, as we pointed out. Until recently, 97% of Blacks were married to Blacks. And it's still, the marriage rate of Black to Black is still higher than any group other than whites. But ours is based on the fact that we like each other. Theirs is based on the fact that they don't like anybody else and have trouble with each other. So this race consciousness, no Garvey movement without race consciousness. Race consciousness woke the Honorable Marcus Garvey up because the African in the Caribbean doesn't have to be race conscious. They're not facing a lynch tree or a Ku Klux Klan in their face every day. But our race consciousness is a race consciousness without hate, except sometimes we've internalized it. So the key point to make is that when blacks come in contact with whites, black takes on a different meaning because it is in relationship to whites. And it is because also, as W.B. Du Bois said, we end up facing double consciousness. That is, some of us see ourselves through the eyes of others. The majority of blacks did not see themselves through the eyes of others. Those are field blacks. The majority of them didn't. Some of them had elements of that in their identity, some elements of not liking themselves, some elements of not fully loving themselves. But basically, field blacks saw themselves as a nation. They had a term for it. Today, we could call it the Black nation. But they saw themselves as a nation. And they viewed those who took on their definition of self from the white man as no nation ends. I don't use that word here. But you know what I mean? No nation ends, meaning people who wanted to be white but would never be accepted by whites and wanted to have nothing to do with Black people. In one slave narrative, there's a formerly enslaved African who had adopted a light-skinned brother who had no parents. This is what commonly happened in slavery. At the end of slavery, this guy goes out and gets in the military and then sends his father a letter. And the letter says, he's had no contact with any Black people since he left him. And he has no interest in Black women. He preferred any woman other than his own kind. And the father said, I took that insurance policy I had for him and tore it up, meaning he wasn't his child anymore. If he didn't respect the love that he received from Black people, if he wanted to be a no nation status, let him be that. And today we have some no nation Negroes. Clarence Thomas is a no nation Negro. When I was at the Million Man March, I remember seeing a sign a brother was carrying. It said, Clarence Thomas should have never been born. The problem is we had enslavement, so it birthed some Clarence Thomases. But don't think that because someone came from the house, they were automatically a no nation Negro, because many in the house didn't love their masters. Many in the house married those in the field, and most in the house had family members in the field. Ella Baker's mother's mother, her grandmother, had been a house slave. Her father was a slave master. He wanted to marry her off to another light-skinned Negro, and she refused. They took her out of the house, put her in the field, and then she married Ella Baker's grandfather, who was the blackest, smartest, bravest Black man she could find. And Ella Baker tried to do the same thing. So this confrontation of Black in the white world put us in a position where Black took on a new meaning. And for some of us, it meant a low self-definition. For some of us, it meant a hatred for self. But for others, it was a source of pride. And for those who took on the first mentality, many of them, by the end of enslavement, underwent transformation over generations and began to embrace a greater sense of self over time. So this is first reason we need transformation. But we need to really appreciate the roots of the transformation. And the roots is in your Blackness. So this is in the construction of what becomes African-American culture. Embracing Blackness is at the foundation of it. Now, in looking at this transformational system, we have to address some serious questions. A great psychiatrist named Frantz Fanon and a great sociologist, E. Franklin Fraser, they both reached similar conclusions that in America, African culture was destroyed. Fanon put it in a profound sense. And if this is true, we shouldn't be walking or talking right now. He said, when the Black perception came in contact with the white perception, or the Black world came in contact and conflict with the white world and went under through colonialism and slavery, Blacks lost two things. And I have to use these words because they're very important. I'll explain them. He said they lost their ontology and their metaphysics. Ontology is your sense of being human. All human beings have a special sense of humanity. And some, you might say, barely have any at all. But they have a concept of what it means to be a human being. According to Fanon, Africans in the enslavement process lost, and the colonial process, lost their sense of what it means to be human because they had bought into this savage narrative. He also said they lost their sense of metaphysics. Metaphysics means the first principles, the principles that govern life, the principles that govern the universe. Here's the deal about this. Fanon was a psychiatrist. He came from Martinique. And E. Franklin Fraser was a sociologist. He was trained at the University of Chicago. Now, there's two things to understand about Martinique and Chicago. Martinicans think they're French. They've been French fried. And Frantz Fanon in his first stage had been French fried. He later woke up. He married to a white woman. Now, let me just say this. Some very conscious Africans, like Sheikh Anta Diop, married to a white woman, but he didn't lose his consciousness. So get this straight. I'm not knocking everybody that marries white. And I'm not knocking Fanon either, but I'm simply saying that he was more susceptible to this idea that colonialism or slavery could knock out your sense of being human and knock out your deep thought, your so-called metaphysics, the deepest thoughts that come out of your culture, in part because of his background. And the University of Chicago is real good for producing people whose minds are white as snow. We had Raymond Wimbush on this show about 3 weeks ago talking about Ethos. And I made the comment, it was a joke, but it was serious. He got a PhD from the University of Chicago. I said, Raymond, that's a rare thing that someone would come out of the University of Chicago, Afrocentric minded like you. And then he said two words, Bobby Wright. Most of you don't know who he was. He was an African-American psychologist who was as conscious as they come. And so he was saved by having a classmate that kept him grounded. So they're asserting that in America, and many of you assert the same thing. You say, they took our culture in slavery. That's what you say. I go and speak to young kids all over the country. And when I ask them, how many of you think you have a culture? Hardly no hands go up. Because we've been fed a false narrative. The only way a people don't have a culture is if they get wiped out. As long as a people live, they will have a culture. The culture may undergo and always will undergo transformation. It'll undergo stress. It'll undergo strains, and it will definitely change. But generally, culture adheres to its fundamentals. So, can I prove this is wrong? First, I want to say that there's a lot of groundbreaking scholarship on this, but you don't have to be a scholar to know this. If you really know your people, you'll know that the African American is more African than even he realizes. Malcolm X made an observation in the Nation of Islam. He said, when you get below the surface of what he called the American Negro, there you will get to the heart and the soul of the African. And Malcolm was able to build the Nation of Islam by pricking in to that African sensibility, that African pride. So, but there are a body of scholarship that challenges this. The most important is Zora Neale Hurston, great Black anthropologist who did a lot of work on just looking at African American culture and showing its African base. A man named Melville Herskovits, a white man, who wrote a book called The Myth of the Negro Past and talked about how African culture is at the foundation of African American culture. W.B. Du Bois had some of his best insights on African American culture, showing its African base. Some very, very creative insights. And there are a host of other scholars, James Smalls, who comes out of South Carolina. So he didn't have to read a book to know that the culture he came out of is African, beautiful African. He knew that. And a host of others, and I'm one of those. In fact, I spend as much time looking at my people's culture as I do Africa. In fact, a little bit more time. Because I said before, it's a poor frog that won't praise its own pond. And it's a poor tree that doesn't respect its own roots. And it's a poor people that don't even have an appreciation of their foundation, of their essence. So if they're wrong, if Frantz Fanon is wrong, if Fraser and others are wrong, what's the proof? Well, let's take the Caribbean, first of all. A great historian, Caribbean historian, he's from Trinidad, Eric Williams, made the comment that when Africans were brought into the Caribbean, they dropped African culture there. They dropped it. And what he meant was the native people, the Native American people, had been exterminated throughout most of the Caribbean. And so these islands filled up 97, 98% African. And you had some slave managers, some slave overseers, but they were a distinct minority. And so in that environment, what's called a hybrid culture developed. Hybridity means it's the meeting of two dissimilar kinds of things, European and African, but the Africans stood largely whole, but influenced by this European thing. So if you listen to the speech patterns of Africans from the Caribbean, it's African-based. The vowel structure, the syntax is African-based. By the way, so is it here. 85% of Black people are Ebonic speakers, and that's a Niger-Congo Bantu linguistic system. It is not Black English. It's got a structure all its own. So in an environment in which Blacks are almost everybody, how do you lose your sense of being human? How do you lose your spirituality? And the best proof that you didn't is the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is the only slave rebellion in the history of the planet Earth that succeeded in overthrowing enslavement. And how did they do it? They did it through drawing from the deep thought of African culture, the deep fundamental principles of African spirituality and what's called metaphysics. And they drew from the deepest sense of humanity. Those that launched that rebellion were voodoo priests. And their voodoo, which is all it means is God, it is the African spirit system that you call religion. There's no word for religion in any African language. So, but there is a word for prayer. There is a word for praise. And there is a word for spirit. And there is a word for praise. And in case you don't know it, when Black people worship in the Black church, they worship in an African way and often don't even know it. And that's a way coming straight out of Africa. So when Bookman, who was one of 7 Hogans who are priests of Africa, coming out of the Yoruba and other African spirit systems, because what happens in the Caribbean is where Catholicism exists, you're able to maintain African spirit systems, but they're mixed because you have Africans from different parts of Africa mixing together. So you have a Pan-African voodoo. It's powerful. And so the launching of that revolution, the success of that revolution, more than anything, was due first to the brutality of the French, but they were no more brutal than anywhere else. It was due to the fact that they piped into the deepest sources of African culture, to the origin ideas, and that gave them the power to defeat one of the best armies in the world. In fact, Napoleon Bonaparte, in terms of ground warfare in Europe, was the best fighter. Dessalines was better. Toussaint was better. The masses of Haiti were better. Why? It was their culture, baby. So far from losing this sense of being human, what they call ontology or metaphysics, the deepest metaphysics, African spirit systems. Let me tell you, where the spirit of God possesses you and gives you information. That was the basis for the success of this revolution. And because that revolution was based on humanism, when other Africans rose up like Simon Bolivar and had to go and hide out in Haiti, the only thing the Haitians asked when they gave him support for his revolution was that they free their slaves. They carry out emancipation. And these Africans, the baddest Africans in the world, they're paying for it right now. Among the poorest. It's their price for having successfully defeated the European. And it's a price that we should make Europe pay through paying reparations to them as well as to us. And that we should use our strategic power to get the anvil off of the necks of Haitian people. So what about the American case? This is where they have their strongest argument, they think. Because in America, Africans were overwhelmed or outnumbered. Because unlike the Caribbean, where you could drop a majority of Africans into an island, whites were the majority here, though in South Carolina and Mississippi, we had large numbers, and in South Carolina, larger numbers than whites. And the most successful slave rebellion, or at least the best planned slave rebellion in the history of enslavement, the Denmark-Vesey Rebellion. It sent fear down the spines of whites. But the key point is that Africans in America faced a different situation. And that situation was one where Euro-Americans could carry out a full-scale attack on African culture, the likes of which Africans experienced nowhere else in the world. And so that is why a lot of people, historians, have concluded, and a lot of us have been given the false narrative, including from some of our own scholars, that slavery destroyed African-American culture. And to do that, again, we'd have to go back to Fanon's point that according to him, slavery and colonialism destroyed the ontology or sense of humanity, and the metaphysics or the deepest structure or deepest ideas in that culture, in African culture. So what is the case for that? The case for that is that it's dead wrong. As I said before, as long as the people live, their culture will continue to live. As we often say, you can take the African out of Africa, but you can't take Africa out of the African. Africa is deeply embedded in the African. We all talk about genetic memory, and we always use it to just refer to the trauma that comes out of slavery, that we have this memory of that. But if genetic memory extends to slavery, then doesn't it extend 144,000 years back? Because that's when the first human beings came into being. They were African. And these human beings, the Twa, gave birth to humanity. They gave birth to civilization. They gave birth to the idea of one God, who they did not see as a human being. So you have a deep structure. And so that structure is certainly genetic. But those, as I've mentioned this before, those who have gone to the other side talk about cellular memory, how God has embedded in our cells a memory of our past. And so we can always explain the inferiority complex by slavery. But how do you explain the sharing, the humanity, the kindness, the love? How do you explain that? Dr. Siri McDougall was talking about how that was very basic to the African American, and I would say African people in general's conception of manhood. It was nurturing, and particularly it was not just providing food, clothing, and shelter, and now both men and women do that, but it was providing love, nurturing, kindness. That's the African American's view of himself. And smart African American women know that when they're looking for a man, that's the kind of man they look for, who's intelligent and everything else, but kind. That comes out of your genetic and cellular memory, comes out of your history and your culture. So what's the case for the African in America? To understand the African American response, we got to look at the African response. The Dogon, a people that I refer to often, the first people that I studied in African culture and African philosophy, or in their philosophy, it's their spirit system. They are the master astrophysicists of the world. In some ways, their astrophysics is more advanced than ancient chemistry. And they refer to a time that physicists, astrophysicists call singularity. Now, you can't get any deeper than this. I mean, if you're going to talk about whether you kept or lost a sense of deep thought, you can't go any deeper than whether you kept the notion of happening before happening happened. That's the Chemite description. Before existence, happening before happening happened. That would be God before happening happened. You know what I mean? Africans have this big concern about origin. We always start with roots, the beginning. African astrophysics is ahead of Western astrophysics, especially because we go back to origin. The pyramids in ancient Kemet, many of them are set according to the star or the star cluster Orion. Why? That's the beginning of the stellar system in our solar system, in our cosmos. So we like to go back to beginnings. And why wouldn't we, since we are the beginning? And so when we look at the Dogon, they talk about a state of existence before existence existed, that astrophysicists call singularity. And physicists say this is a state where only a wrinkle existed in what is now the cosmos, only a wrinkle. That was all. Now, this state of singularity in physics and in astrophysics is the period before relativity, before time. Now, the Bambara, when they talk about God, who they call Mangala, they say God is infinite force outside of space and outside of time. Outside of space and outside of time. So if a people hold on to their metaphysics, that is, to the fundamental first principles, the first principles of life, then if they pipe into this, they're not just tying into something, they're tying into the deepest part of it, the origin. And so what happens with Africans in enslavement in this country, but I know this was true throughout the Western Hemisphere as well. Observant African American historians and African historians will tell you this. And I'll tell you this because I have 3 subjects I master: African philosophy, African American philosophy, African history, African American history, Black political movements, and then a lot of other philosophies, a lot of other histories. And so I know from study, I know this, that while Africans underwent this horrendous experience of enslavement in this country and in the Western Hemisphere, none was worse than any other. They were all vicious. We just had the numbers against us. While we all went through that, and every effort was made to break our spirit, you ask, how did Africans survive this? Well, we're resilient. You could say that, you know what I mean? No matter how bad things are, we always believe, because of the way our culture is set up, that things will get better. That's a part of it. Part of the reason is, and I want you to really listen to this, while we went through hard times, 249 years of it here, part of that time, most enslaved Africans lived outside of time. I want you to hear that. What that means is they piped into God's realm and communicated with God. And they drew from the deepest principles of the cosmos. So in one slave narrative, it's a sister picking cotton. And in the middle of picking cotton, God visits her and tells her, this ain't going to happen forever. And she starts jumping up and down and shouting and continues to pick cotton. When she comes off the field, old Miss Ann says, what are you jumping about? And she told her. She had an experience. She didn't tell her what it was, but she had an experience. She got whipped for it. But she was out of time. She was in contact with God, and God was telling her, this ain't going to exist forever, because God is outside of time and outside of space. And God was right. The leaders on virtually every plantation in the United States were not preachers, contrary to popular opinion. Most Blacks in enslavement rejected Christianity. Most. Very few took it on. Most of those were house slaves. Most Blacks saw as their leaders diviners who were African priests, who they went to consult about their destiny. You might say, well, what's the destiny of a slave? Well, the destiny of a slave had to do with the question of, when in the hell could we get out of here? How could we end this? But when the enslaved were asked in slave narratives, why did you go to these diviners? They all gave the same answer. And anytime you get the same answer from Black people, you know they're putting the wool over your eyes. They all said, we went to the diviner so that we could find out if we were going to get a whipping, and then to avoid that whipping, because the diviner is supposed to have spirit powers and get that off of you. But the reason they went to the diviner, they're not going to tell a white interviewer, and those are the ones that conducted these WPA work progress administration surveys done under Roosevelt during the Depression. So it was white people running around interviewing ex-slaves. They're not going to tell you. But the reason was they were consulting their destiny. When Frederick Douglass tried to make his first escape, the old wise man on his plantation, who was a diviner, told him, "Don't do it, Fred. The eagle's going to get you." Because he could prophesize the eagle was the United States. He could prophesize that he'd get caught. Fred went ahead and did it and got caught. But the next time it was a different story. So the leader on virtually every plantation was the holder of the deepest metaphysics that African people have, the spirit system of Africa. As Du Bois said, they were the natural leaders of Black people. They were the healers of the sick, the comforter of the sorrowful, and the natural leaders of the masses. No rebellion in slavery, except one, operated without a spirit or metaphysical foundation, without God up in it. And none have really embraced the masses of our people to this day unless it had a spiritual component. So in enslavement, Africans would go to the furthest removed shack, or they would go to a river. They would go to some hidden place and put their heads under a bucket. These places were called hush harbors, and they would call on the spirit until the spirit possessed them, until they were outside of time and they got a message. That's the same thing that happened in voodoo, except in this case, it wasn't a priest conducting the rite. It was everyday Black people conducting that rite. And so what we see is Blacks drew on these fundamental principles. Harriet Tubman, how did she pull off so many successful moves into the South, bringing back enslaved Africans? How did she do that? Because it would be almost impossible to not get caught at some point. There were so many slave patrols and everything else because she had second sight. Du Bois called it, you know. She had that deep insight that would tell her, don't go this way. They're there. They're over here. But they're not here, you know. George Washington Carver, you hear me mention him a lot. A lot of people have put him down because that's all you ever heard in school. You didn't really hear about the real George Washington Carver. You didn't hear about the real George Washington Carver that talked to plants, that thought God's thoughts. You didn't hear about that George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver was the greatest scientist in the world because he piped in to the fundamental truths of the cosmos, because in his humility, he was able to think God's thoughts. The key thing to understand about the African in America, the African in the Caribbean, or wherever we were, is God was first. But it wasn't God coming from a book. It was God who was inside of each of us. It was drawing from that spirit that was within each of us. And so every rebellion had at his heart spirit. Nat Turner, he saw blood on the leaves. He saw messages and signs that told him he was supposed to lead a rebellion that was drawn on the deepest metaphysical principles. And he had the most successful of the slave rebellions. He killed them a whole lot of whites. And what he did is he set an example, because he was a member of the secret society called the Loyal League. And his example was his crucifixion, or his murder by these whites after they caught him, was in Jerusalem. And he was a nominal Christian. He was really a spirit man because his stuff came from within. And he said, and those of the Loyal League said, he was setting an example for us, an example of what would happen to whites if they didn't end this savage system called enslavement. He was setting an example of Black courage, Black manhood, and Black pride. So far from it. Slavery did not uproot the deepest principles of African culture, principles of origin. In fact, it drove us to even draw from them at a deeper level. But here's the deal with the enslaved African. The enslaved African did not believe that his suffering alone guaranteed him a place in heaven or guaranteed him freedom. The enslaved African knew that they could praise the Lord, but they would have to pass some kind of ammunition. They would have to do something to break the bonds of enslavement themselves. And yes, some of our people succumbed to this double consciousness. Some of them, in their belief in God, believed that God permitted this enslavement. This was a part of God's plan for punishing us for the wrong that we had done. We hear some Black people saying that today. We were put here by divine purpose, like hell. We were put here by John Hawkins. God didn't have nothing to do with it. He put us on the good ship Jesus, but that wasn't Jesus bringing us here. It was John Hawkins and company and the Queen of England. You hear me? And if you're going to say that Blacks are being punished for the wrong we've done through enslavement, then why wouldn't whites be even more punished for the wrongs they've done? God is neutral in those affairs. If you're going to get a chance to get God on your side, you're going to have to do something to free yourself. So some of us bought into these mythologies, but most of us knew better. So when we look at the free the mind system, the transformational system, we have to understand that it has a firm foundation, and that foundation is in the fundamental first principles of the cosmos, and those rest with God. My best ideas have come through thinking God's thoughts or piping into God's minds. All breakthroughs in all areas of science, music, mathematics, I don't care what it is, comes through that realm. John Coltrane moved from being an ordinary to an extraordinary musician through practice, through getting off of drugs and alcohol, and through the intervention of God. And he became one of the greatest musicians in the history of the world. You see this outfit I have on here, this right here, guy with the trumpet, that's Miles Davis. And then on the other side is Oba T'Shaka. I decided to wear this because I'm honoring two cultures, African and New African. And Miles was one creative brother. He also piped into something higher. By the way, most jazz musicians, when they are really in a creative state, they talk about going to the zone, where music flows out of them that they never knew they were capable of playing before. And Miles had that capacity. When he would enter a recording studio, he'd only have 2 or 3 notes of music. And then he would say, good music starts with what you know, because he had nearly lost his voice through an operation. He didn't follow direction not to talk for a while. Hard for Miles not to talk. And then he said, great music comes when you go beyond yourself, beyond yourself. So in this transformational system, we need to understand it stands on a firm foundation. And it's a firm foundation that is rooted in the deepest principles of origin. And nothing can be deeper than piping into God's mind. By the way, when you pipe into God's mind, it's very easy to outfox a slave master or a political or economic system like we face and a racist system like we face today. But this argument by Fraser and by Frantz Fanon also rests on the assumption that they wiped our culture out. And so in enslavement, we didn't continue with an African culture. What Africans ended up doing in enslavement here was pulling off something very special. They ended up creating a new African culture. I'm going to go into that in a minute, founded on African principles with new additions. But one of the old principles that we drew from out of Africa and is basic to our souls and our heart was the mighty truth. A few weeks ago, I talked about the Bambara and for them, how lying was considered a moral leprosy. It was such a bad thing that they equated it with a disease that just emaciates a person, turns them into virtually nothing, strips them of their skin and everything else. And for them, lying was of that disorder. The African coming into the Americas, including the United States, came in with a great sense of integrity, which is at the heart of being human. But they came in conflict with a people, the Euro-American, in this case, the European and the Caribbean or South America, who came out of a different culture. Now, one of my specialties is European philosophy and history. Because as a warrior, you got to know your enemy. So I study them. It's not an enjoyable study, but it's a necessary study. And so what I found is when you look at the Aryan, who is the root of the European, I'll go into Aryan at another time. They came out of a culture, and it remains to this day, though it has a Christian coating on the top of it. When I say a Christian coating, Christianity is not a European religion. It's Hebrew. And so it's one grafted on to European culture. They've used it, but it is not at the core of their belief system, especially not New Testament, not Jesus, not turn the other cheek, not forgive your enemy, not love your neighbors. That is not where their culture is coming from. Their culture is teleological. What does that mean? Teleological means it's a use-oriented culture. If you study their culture, we have not studied anything other than white supremacy. And I don't use the term, by the way. You don't see me using the term white supremacy. The sister I had on the show a couple of weeks ago, Sister Kuji Chagalia, which a lot of you love, former student of mine, she doesn't use the term either. Why? For her, it's disempowering, white supremacy. It's a term they invented, by the way. But for me, it's inaccurate. Whites are in decline, supreme over what? When have they won a war? You know? The Cubans kicked their butt in the Bay of Pigs. The Vietnamese kicked their butt. The North Koreans ran them out of North Korea with the help of Mao Zedong. I was a brainwashed Marine in the Marine Reserves. I never did any fighting. It was before I woke up. And they called this a strategic withdrawal. This was a strategic behind kicking. Strategic withdrawal my butt. If two gangs meet and one runs, they got whipped. And when have you ever seen a boxer get in a ring and run? You hear me? At least he stands up and gets knocked out and threw a few punches, maybe, you know? So white supremacy, my behind. They ain't supreme anymore. In a few years, they won't be supreme in numbers in this country. And in a few years, China is going to be the foremost power. Asia today, Africa tomorrow, baby. You hear me? Billion Africans getting themselves together. So when we look at this enslavement system, we have to understand that the Africans came in with into conflict with a culture alien to their own, whereas their culture was a culture founded on truth. The Aryan or European culture is teleological, it's use-oriented. And so what does this mean? The Greeks are considered to be the fount of Western civilization. A lot of us will stress the fact that Greek civilization is based on Kemetic or Egyptian, and that's true to a point. George James' book, Stolen Legacy, stresses this, but only to a point. Yes, Kemet had an influence on Greece, but fundamentally, the Greek is Aryan. And the Aryan, who now we call European, when they say good, they do not mean kind, right, honest, or just, or truthful. They mean whatever they've done that is good for them is good. So if they enslave you, it's good. In all Indo-Aryan or European languages, good has the same meaning. It means strong. And bad means weak. One reason why Trump is so appealing to whites is that he's in the embodiment of that. He just hasn't really developed his faculties. Because if he did, he might have had enough sense, even if he didn't have the compassion to do something for this COVID-19 virus that's killing people off like flies. Because he had no compassion, doesn't listen. He just went on instincts. And as a result, we whipped him. But that is the nature of the Aryan or the Euro-American, is that power is the supreme thing. Power is good, weakness is bad. The African, on the other hand, has this idea that truth is the most important thing. In ancient Kemet, this was called Ma'at, harmony, balance, justice, right order, but its essence was truth. What did the Kemites say? Speak truth, do truth. That was the meaning of Ma'at. For the ancient Africans, and I've said this before, the notion of truth was to know the truth is to be the truth. That was the basis for African ethics or African morality. It's taught by almost every African mother and every African American mother, or African Caribbean, or African South. I don't care where you come from. The most important thing that most Black mothers will say about their children is that they're good children. That is the most important thing for them. They are good children. And so truth for us is measured in practice. It's walking your talk. That's what we respect the most. On the plantation, therefore, did we, and this is the essence of your humanity, because if you have honor, if you have a sense of righteousness, then you will be a special kind of human being. And for us, what's extraordinary is ordinary for Black people. It's ordinary for a Black person to take in a family member and raise them. It's normal for a Black person to take an extremely sick family member, and I referred to this before, Alzheimer's, the hardest illness to treat, and to take them in for years and wear their own health down while they do that. It's ordinary for us. It's extraordinary for other people. What I say about African culture and African American culture is that humanism is so strong, we could lose 90% of it and still have more than almost the rest of humanity, except for probably Native Americans, and we have far from lost any 90%. Because if we look at the state of Africans at the end of enslavement, where we didn't have an acre or a mule or 2 pennies to rub together, we stuck together. And as Carter G. Woodson said, that if a former enslaved African met another that needed a quarter and they only had a quarter, they would give them that last quarter. He said, we were sharing to a fault. My grandmother, and I know everybody has stories like this, who was poorer than a church mouse, had to work most of her life until my uncle took care of her and she didn't have to work anymore. Someone would come to her door. It could be white or black in need of food. She'd sit them down and fix them a good breakfast when she hardly had any food to eat herself. This is the humanity of our people. We have survived because of that. But the adherence to the truth is the key thing. On the plantation, that was what was called Himbi, the Himbi tradition. That means Himbi, whatever they believe. Himbi, a Muslim. Himbi, a healer. Himbi, what he thinks, what he believes. Himbi, the truth. So that Africans measured it that way. Contracts were sealed based on your word. Now you'd better have a contract in writing, notarized. I'm advising you of that. Don't go on anybody's word. You can't. You're in a word of, what do they say? Forked tongues. Say one thing and do another. On the plantation, the worst, most savage white person was the Christian enslaver who would whip you while he's reading the Bible. You hear me? So we held on to this moral code. And I want to say this about Ma'at. For the Kemites, the ancient Egyptians, Ma'at described their ethos. Ethos is what's unique about you in the world. E-T-H-O-S, ethos. It's your bearing. When you see people coming out of a certain culture, you just know it by their bearing. I can tell a continental African from an African American. It's in their face. It's not the complexion. It's in their face. The culture's in their face. It's also in the way they walk. The African American has a walk. Have you ever noticed it? Especially the black man. Even Barack Obama's got him a walk. Surprised me. He got him a strut. You know what I mean? So ethos, for the Kemites, Ma'at was their ethos. Why? Because they're coming out of a great civilization. And it is a civilization that is highly spirit-based. That's the center of it. God-centered. Their astronomy, their astrophysics is based on figuring out the proper days for worshiping God. Or their physics, the noon, the idea that, you're coming out of this watery-like mass that has electromagnetic energy. That is quantum physics. This is coming out of their spirit system of origin. So for them to maintain a civilization, you got to be righteous. It doesn't mean they always were, but it means that that was their essence. Whereas in America, the essence is power and money. It's a very different system and a very different ethos. I say that to say this. The African in America has a different ethos. We draw from ancient Africa. We have new influences, racism being one, that led us to shape an ideal of race consciousness that has forged racial unity. But this experience was unique in that the heaviest attack was made on our people, made on any African people in the Western Hemisphere because of the numbers of whites. They did everything they could to wipe this culture out. And that is why you have historians and psychiatrists like Frantz Fanon saying that our culture was destroyed here. Good reason to think that it could be, because even though culture persists as long as the people live, if there was any case where a people's culture could be wiped out, they certainly had the advantages on their side in this country. To understand what happened here is to understand a mythical folk hero in African American culture. People who know the culture know this folk hero, others don't. Brer Rabbit. Now, in the Caribbean, it's Anansi, who is the spider. That is suited to the Caribbean sensibility. But here, Brer Rabbit is a mythical African creature, because a lot of stories in Africa were animal tales that were really stories about people. And so in Brer Rabbit, it is always the conflict between Brer Rabbit and the fox. Brer Rabbit symbolizes enslaved Africans. The fox symbolizes the white man. Remember what Malcolm said about the fox. He said, just because that fox comes smiling at you, don't think that that fox is a friend of yours. He said that fox is a member of the canine family, the dog family. He's got a grin on his face. He's getting ready to eat you. You know what I mean? But the key point is, Brer Rabbit doesn't have at his disposal some of the equipment that the fox has, like those teeth, you know, and the other equipment that he can use to tear you apart. But Brer Rabbit in every conflict ends up outmaneuvering and outfoxing the fox. African Americans today, when they make moves, one of my favorite people who lives right in front of me, Joe Levine, when he was working for the city of Oakland and they were trying to set him up, he'd come back and say, because he ran repairs for the streets in Oakland, came back and said, brother, I Brer Rabbited him. Brer Rabbited him. You hear me? So the struggle between Africans in the US to recreate culture, which was the same as the struggle to extend and maintain and further their humanity, is symbolized by Brer Rabbit, because we had to go inside ourselves and get extremely brilliant, draw on deep wisdom to come up with ways to outfox the fox who's out there to tear up your most sacred possession, which is your way of life and your design for living, your culture. Brer Rabbit, by the way, was always linked to another figure that symbolizes what happened in enslavement. And this is a figure called High John the Conqueror. In the blues, they call him High John the Conqueror. High John the Conqueror was an African male spirit, symbolic of African bravery and African warriorhood. High John the Conqueror came on the slave ships. He was a part of the spirit of the enslaved African. High John the Conqueror was often disguised in the form of Brer Rabbit. And so in history, High John the Conqueror was real. He was a man named Colonel Rockman, the manager of a plantation in Mississippi, who had been a colonel in the Fulani army, who had been conquered in war in Mali, and was put in charge of running a plantation in Mississippi, but he was actually a leader in the Loyal League. He was a spy, and he was older, gray-haired, muscular. If you looked at him, you could see he was somebody you shouldn't mess with. But he was disguised as Brer Rabbit. He was running a plantation. The master thought he was loyal until he decided to petition the king of Morocco, to petition the president of the United States to cut him free because his daughter was going to be put in slavery. So Brer Rabbit in the form of High John the Conqueror was real. That was Nat Turner. You hear me? Who for the longest was viewed as just a preacher, but who was a man who saw in his dreams messages from God. And when he died, he was a sacrificial example, as I pointed out before. For members of the Loyal League, he was a member. So what does all of this say? This says that the African in America had to use creative resources to draw from the depth of their soul the deepest principles of the origin of the cosmos, piping into God's mind, drawing inspiration that could keep them going from day to day, to draw out of their souls the fundamental truths and principles of Africa, of spirit, of God, of family, of extended family, of humanism, of twinness, of the word, and many, many other things. And in the process of what they did was right under the nose of the fox, we Brer Rabbited them. And we created a new African culture. That's why I don't call it African American, though it's okay if you want to call it that. But it's New African because it's founded on the fundamental principles of Africa with new principles mixed into this situation, one of which is race consciousness, another of which is Pan-Africanism, the notion that Africans are one, and many others. And it is a culture that has negative influences that we have to work on, some of which we've talked about. And so this is the key thing to get about this culture. We say we don't have a culture, but it is the popular culture of the United States. Across the world, it is the popular culture of the world. If your culture was lost, how's anybody going to find your culture the most popular? And it's the most complex because we come out of a mixture of complexities of African cultures, and then we come into the most complex situation Africans face anywhere in the world, and it would therefore lead us to have to draw on more resources to come up with something more complex to overcome it. So here's the point, and I'm going to wrap up, summarize, and be finished on this. The African American in the United States, because of the circumstances that we faced here, shaped a new ethos. Just as the ethos of Kemet and Africa was the truth, and it continued to be central to us, ethos is what defines the essence of a people. And historical circumstance has a lot to do with how people come to shape a special way of behaving in the world, of thinking in the world, of acting in the world, of being in the world. And so in drawing from the inner souls of Africa, the souls, as Du Bois called it, of Black folks, we had to draw on a resource that it wasn't necessary for other Africans to draw on to the same level, because they didn't have to go into their souls to recreate a culture. It was dropped in the Caribbean and it was continued. And then they had to fight the slave influences and everything else. So what is that ethos? And this is what I really want to say to everybody here. Biggest weakness of Black people in this country is we underestimate our greatest strengths. And our greatest strength is our culture. It is beautiful beyond expression. When God hears, the art form, which is the other achievement of enslaved Blacks, we didn't just create a new African culture based on fundamental African principles with new additions. We created an art form. And that art form is beautiful beyond beauty itself. And the high point of that art form is what I'm wearing here, jazz, Black classical music, because it's the most complex and beautiful of all that we created, but it rests on the spiritual blues. So what is it that makes us unique? There's an African-American saying that helps describe this. That saying goes like this: I would rather be the worst innovator than the best imitator. Hear me? What this is saying, innovation is at the peak of what we do. The innovator is the one that creates new systems. George Washington Carver was an innovator. He was one. Coltrane was an innovator. Miles was an innovator, you know? In every field, there's 1 or 2% that are in that innovative area. And so even if you aren't a good innovator, our ethos demands that we try and be original. And so what is the ethos of the African in America? The ethos of the African in America is creativity. You're the most creative Africans on the planet, and you're the most creative people on the planet. Not because we were any more special than any other Africans, but because the circumstances that we were in called on us to draw on this resource. And so it has enabled us to bring beauty into the world. Beauty on many different levels, but it's manifested in the character of our people. We have basically, as families, survived because of the creativity of our parents. My great-grandmother, Sylvia Brown, she looked after a household full of children that was near broke. My grandmother worked and she took care of the children. And at night, she'd go into the pantry. There was literally nothing in that pantry. And she'd pull something out and make it. And the kids would all say, my mother included, "What is it, Grandma?" She'd say it, "Slop Gullion." If she just said slop, you wouldn't want to eat it. But Gullion, well, there must be something to it. That's at the soul of Black folks. You hear me? Creativity. You never know what a Black person is going to do. That's what I always say. You know, the hardest thing to do with Black people is predict us. I don't even try, because creativity is at our core. And so when we look then at systems for transformation, then what we need to do is appreciate the fact that we have created something special here. And we need to draw from African culture to restore memory, something that we've lost through enslavement, to strengthen our families and extended family communities. We need to draw from the best of our African past to strengthen this African-American reality. But we need to appreciate what we have created here. And I want to say, in the sixfold stages of mental freedom, those who are caught in this no nation Negro category, which is the category in the sixfold stages of assimilation, this is the path for de-assimilating. This is the path for finding your way from being in no nation to being a part of your own nation. So, but how do we do that? One is we have to read. You can't lead unless you read. You can't lead a meaningful life unless you draw from the best ideas around you that will help to enrich you, enrich your life. I ask my my wife, I said, what did love mean to her? She said, it means growth. She wants to grow. And if you're going to love yourself, you got to grow. Growing is essential in life. So the sixfold stages of mental freedom, this whole thing of what we need to do to prepare for freeing our minds, it means appreciating the depths from which we come from, understanding the African root to understand the new African root. So I hope you got something out of this. We're going to open it up now. If any people have any questions or comments, I'd like to hear them. But this is a part of a journey, and we'll be doing a lot more of this in the future.
First one up. Will you speak on the Gullah Geechee in terms of religion and traditional African spiritual systems?
The question is, what about the Gullah Geechee and their religion and spiritual African traditional systems? The Gullah Geechee are people off the coast of South Carolina. Some of them are also found in Georgia, off the coast of Georgia. And these are people who, one, have been isolated to some extent for a long time from the direct influences of European culture, and could hold on to African culture in a pure form than almost anywhere else in the United States. The Gullah Geechee people are people who at the end of enslavement practiced praise worship. And they had more praise houses in their communities than churches. And when Blacks made the decision to embrace Christianity, it was on their terms, and even their churches would have mourning benches, mourning, where you had to experience the spirit before you could join the church. The Gullah Geechee people speak a Niger-Congo Bantu language, which is the basis for Ebonics in this country, but their speech pattern is more pure. They practice the ring shout. And the ring shout is a counterclockwise dance, started with the chwa, that mirror the elliptical movements of planets. And these are dances done all over Africa through a shuffle. And that shuffle that dance is designed to stabilize the cosmos. So there's a group now that is still alive called the McIntosh County Singers. I listen to them on KPFA radio. It's a show on gospel music. Emily Powell started as another sister who runs it now. It's beautiful. And they have danced at the Smithsonian Institute and whatnot. They've recorded them. If you go on YouTube, you can find them. And they are dancing in the old way of the spirituals. But what's interesting about not just their dances, their singing. Their singing is in the intonations of West Africa, which is where the spirituals come from. But they're revised in this situation. So they are an example of the root, the firm root. But the new African is one that had to be recreated.
How can we strengthen the new African culture with looking at the Dogon philosophy and cosmology?
How do we strengthen new African culture? By looking at Dogon philosophy and culture. First of all, just the overall strengthening. We need to appreciate the culture we have. We have never assessed this culture. Now that is really taking something for granted. It's like being married and not talking to each other. It's like being married and not even knowing the person you're married to. We're married to our culture. Our culture's in us. And we live it every day. And if you don't know it, the chances are you might live the negative parts of it. So we need to assess it. And I would say one of the first things we need is a African American or new African cultural renaissance that mirrors patterns and even goes beyond the African-centered cultural renaissance of the 80s and 90s that influenced hip hop and influenced a lot of our people. We don't need one or the other, we need both. And that means we need to appreciate it and renew it. That's renewal. Or in Kemet, it's called Septepi, returning to the first occasion, which is their term for Renaissance, which means going back to the period that was most just, because the first occasion is the Twa. In Kemet, it's pre-dynastic Kemet. In Africa, it's ancient African history and culture, where you could walk from one end of the continent to the other and not experience rape or robbery or murder, because people lived in a sharing ethos. Now, when it comes to the Dogon, for me, the Dogon are the place where I started my study of deep thought of what Europeans call African philosophy. And I did it because the Dogon had not been influenced by Christianity or Islam. And then I moved on to Kemetic, Yoruba, Sante. My priest is a Babalawo, Yoruba system. I think there's a lot we can draw from the Dogon. The one I would stress here that I deliberately didn't go into today, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, is the thought pattern. There's a lot of things with the Dogon, but the Dogon have what I call a twin thought pattern, but that's African, and it's basic to African American culture. That's a discussion for another time. But the key thing is, twin thought means that it's a thought where things are connected, not disconnected. So instead of seeing life and death as separate, life is slow dying. Instead of seeing good and bad as separate, good is bad and bad is good. And by the way, that's intrinsic to our culture. I say it's bad, that means it's good, right? Our culture cuts that way. So there's a lot of things we can draw from the Dogon, one of which is their thought pattern. And of course, their astrophysics system, of which we know something about. That's another. And much, much, much more. Any others?
Mm-hmm. Looking at the life of Dr. John Henrik Clarke, in particular, his encyclopedic memory, do your study suggest a method we can duplicate his feat?
Good question. Given John Henrik Clarke's encyclopedic memory, do I have a way or suggestions on how we can repeat this feat? I should preface this answer by saying that I apprenticed under John for at least 15 years and interviewed him for the last 8 months of his life on the book I'm writing now on masters. He's one of the 6 masters that I study. And I got pretty deep into John's thought processes. And he was an admirable human being. But let me just say before I answer the question of his memory, the most important thing about John Henrik Clarke was his character. He was a loving, kind human being, humble to the core. But humble did not mean that he underestimated himself. His common statement, well, he didn't say this all the time, but every now and then he'd say, he had a mind better than 40 people. I'd say, John, more like 400. But the point is, John was there to help people and care for people. In John's case, reading was definitely a key to this because John had a library of 25,000 books. If you look at the books behind me, I have a library of 10,000. I'd have more if I could negotiate more space. I got a lot on the floor, but I'm also a warrior. So I'm not just a scholar, I'm a scholar, spirit, warrior. John was a pure scholar. That was John's whole thing. And so John was a reader, and he was at heart a professor, and they called him Fess when he was being raised. Fess, short for professor, as a child. So I think a lot of John's memory was tied to his discipline in reading. But also he comes out of an oral culture. The Southern Black culture is oral. And so that culture places a great emphasis on memory. But John didn't just have a great memory, John was creative. And so he never repeated himself. I remember interviewing him once, and I asked him the same question I had asked him in a previous interview. And he gave me a different but not inconsistent answer. And I understood what he was doing. And I said, you're like Coltrane. You never play the same song the same way. I said, you never give the exact same answer. And he said, no, because life is like, he said, a circle. Actually, it's like a spiral. The planets move elliptically, not circularly, except for one or two. And so what he meant was, he said, you start at one place, you go to somewhere else, and you start seeing something else. And part of what you saw before was right, part of it was wrong, and so you're making correction. That's the humility. So John had this creativity. And so his memory wasn't just about regurgitating. It was about drawing from something in the past and then coming up with some very creative conclusions right now. John was a great improviser, master improviser. Any others?
Marcel Griaule has two works in English, Conversations with Oba T'Shaka and The Pale Fox. There are a number of papers in French. Are you aware of anyone translating those into English?
Gee, these are good questions. This person asked, he said that there's a book by Marcel Griaule and also a guy named Dieterling on the second one called Conversations with Oba T'Shaka, the other, The Pale Fox. And these have been translated from French into English. Do I know of any other translations into English? There's a book called African World, and in that there's a translation of the overall sense of the pale fox. Conversations with Oba T'Shaka is a conversation with a Dogon wise man, a former hunter who went blind hunting and then took up the deep thought. The Dogon called their system deep knowledge. By the way, Dr. Jacob Carruthers, who was one of my teachers, wouldn't use the term African philosophy, though he understood it was valid. He called it deep thought. And it's interesting, I don't think he knew that the Dogon called their system deep knowledge based on astrophysics. And when you understand that philosophy is really deep thought, then you're not going to say you don't have a philosophy, because you know you have deep thinkers. And we have deep thought in this country. We're just referring to a few before. So in the case of Conversations with Oba T'Shaka, that's a conversation over a number of days with Oba T'Shaka, this former hunter turned wise man, who discussed some guiding principles in Dogon deep thought. Jiriso, Beniso, and Boloso. Jiriso, the word in front of you, called forward. Beniso, the word on the side of you, called sideward. Boloso, hidden word, the word behind you. So that's an exposition on that. I went through that for a good 20 years because you have to internalize this. This is reorienting you to the cosmos. Sodaya, or the pale fox, is Sodaya, the clear word. It's the fourth level. It's the highest level. And there are corresponding levels in African American systems. I'm not going into that now. We have the same systems the Dogon have. It's not grounded in astrophysics, but it's grounded in the same fundamental principles. So that's a good question. And people should, along with the study of other African cultures, should study the Dogon. The Dogon are bad. Any others?
Yes. Can you list the stages that lead to innovation with definition?
Are these questions coming from different people?
Mm-hmm.
Can I deal with the stages of innovation with the description of the ways in which you go through them?
Mm-hmm.
innovation in Dogon system is described as the edifice of knowledge. That means it's the highest level. It's the system of Dogon thought in its ordered complexity. So for them, Sodaya is the realm of the Hogan, who are priests, who are themselves astrophysicists, who are either masters of one realm or some realms or all realms, and probably very few are masters of all realms. And you have this equivalency throughout many other African systems of Mbara, the Fulani, many others, though the Dogon are the masters when it comes to astrophysics. So that is the Dogon system. The African American system, the way to understand it, because we have to understand how we apply it here, is the third level in our system, and it's the level of innovation. And that is described as the level in which you create new systems in whatever area it is, new systems of music, new systems of science, new systems of art, whatever it is, new systems of athletics. Satchel Paige was a pitcher, and he created new pitches. He had a fastball. I used to pitch. I'm nowhere near in his league. And he had what he called 3 fastballs: fast, faster, and fastest. Now that's innovation in pitching. People just have a fastball. And then he had a hesitation pitch where the pitch could actually hesitate for a millisecond. Ain't no pitcher been able to do that. That's innovation in baseball, you know. In terms of how you get there, you have to go through the other stages. And it's a question of mastery at these other levels. And innovation never really occurs without God's help. Real innovation. I'm not talking about creating some new toothpaste or something, you know, or someone who comes up with a new design for a coat. No, I'm talking about someone who comes up with something like, and it's not just Black people that have this, the theory of relativity. On the plane in which it operates, no holes in it, no error. You know, that's the nature of innovation, or Sodaya, clear word. And so that means people at this level discover something. They're not really creating something. They discover what was already there, but no one else knew about it before. I mean, that's basically what innovation really is, you know. So Einstein discovered theory of relativity. George Washington Carver discovered certain things in the healing of plants. My stuff on the family comes through the light. It's innovation. I didn't invent it. I discovered what was already there. And that's one that's lying in the weeds. I'm going to be raising that one up, because that one is going to save you when it comes to your families. No holes in it. So that's the key thing. So you got to move through the lower stages. And most people that get to the level of innovation, they didn't plan to get there. They didn't expect to get there. It's an experience that for them was unexpected. And so it's not something that I'm going to say, I'm going to be an innovator. That's something that happens, but you have to work at it. It doesn't happen on its own. That's it. Wow. That was good. That tests me. I mean, if I don't know what I'm talking about, I'm in trouble if I get some questions like this. I really enjoy this. So this has been an important experience for me. I hope it's been an important experience for you. The topic was preparations for African and New African identity transformations. And life is nothing about growing, transforming. In our culture, becoming more better, you know. So I hope you got something out of this. And I hope you also check out the book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. You can get it by going to Oba T'Shaka, OBA-TSHAKA, Gumroad. Get the book. I'll also send you the 40+ page paper on the sixfold stages to mental freedom.
That's in the, I put it
Thank
in the
you.
chat. I put the link in the chat. Links in the chat.
Hit in.
You hit in, yes.